Good afternoon, everybody. So it's nice to see you. The numbers dwindle every week, but I predicted that. I think you may remember. Hopefully people are watching recordings. It's up to you. I don't have any, well, I do have skin in the game in the sense that, I spend a lot of time with people who are interested in converting, but if you decide not to, that's fine. If you decide to drop the class, that's cool too. But I do want to say that there's some people I have not met with because you're living in a different city, and I'm assuming you're going to go through a rabbi in your own city. However, if you would like to meet with me, I'm happy to do it. I know, like David and Carlos, you're in other places, like I think you're both in San Diego, right? David, you're in San Diego?
I'm in Los Angeles.
You're in, right. Carlos, you're in Los Angeles, and you're working with Denise Egger, and and David. Yeah. So anyway, I know you're working with them, but if for some reason you would like to meet and talk about whatever has been going on in the class, more than happy to meet with you. So just send me an email, and I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
But the people I regularly meet with are the people who are either living here or have a complicated situation, like they're living far away from a synagogue. Okay, so today we are going to talk about Passover. Does anybody remember anything about the month that Passover is in? Anybody remember the name of it?
Is it Nissan?
It's Nisan. Thank you. Who said that?
Me.
Oh, the brand new student. Okay. I know I saw Stephen raise his hand. So Stephen, do you know what Nisan is in the Bible? What month of the year it is? Do you remember that? You're muted. You're muted.
I always figure we celebrate Passover in April.
It's usually around April. We have a complicated calendar. It's a lunar calendar, but it gets adjusted every few years because Passover is always supposed to be in the spring, and the New Year's also always supposed to be in the fall. So if we just were lunar, then it would change. So it gets adjusted all the time. So Passover is usually March, April, and New Year's usually September, October. But does anyone remember what that month is, Nisan, in our calendar, in the Bible, not in post-biblical period?
Is it the fourth month?
It's the first month. Remember I talked about the fact that we have several New Years in Judaism. So Nisan in the Bible is the first month. Post-biblical, anybody remember what month is the new year? It's Tishrei. Okay, those are not easy questions to answer. And Passover gets celebrated on the 14th of Nisan. What happens in the middle of a month? Let's say in terms of the environment. Christine,
the moon?
Full moon, right? It's a full moon on the 15th. So we start on the evening of the 14th and we go into the 15th, and that is the full moon. And that's when Passover is. The beginning of the month is a new moon, which is like a teeny little sliver that somebody has to find. Okay, so I'm going to now share my screen. So Passover, and the reason I shifted things around a little bit is because I wanted to help you get prepared for Passover, right? Because initially it was the same day as the Passover Seder, but I figured there's some things that need to be done before we get to Passover. So here are the big ideas around Passover. Now in Hebrew, Passover is called Pesach. It empowers each generation to pass down the Jewish story to the next generation, which in turn adds its many voices to the continuing saga of the Jewish people. Each generation has a responsibility to tell the Jewish story to the next generation. So just as the Torah is passed down from generation to generation, and we symbolically enact that during a bar mitzvah, at least in the Reform movement, by having grandparents, parents, and child up on the bima, which is the pulpit, passing the Torah down, literally passing it down. We also pass down the experience of the Exodus, and we tell it from one generation to the other. We're obligated to feel as if we ourselves went forth from Egypt. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little later, but the idea is it's not just, let's tell this history that happened a long time ago. It is that we are supposed to really feel as though we've been through this experience ourselves, that we were slaves in Egypt and that we were redeemed. Now, the word in Hebrew for Egypt is Mitzrayim, and that means narrow places. So Egypt was a narrow place in the sense that we were slaves. Obviously, that's a horrible place to be in. But we have so many different ways in which we feel that we're in narrow places. We have a loss in our life, somebody we cared about, a job, whatever loss it is that we feel, or whatever darkness we're feeling at a particular time. Maybe we're feeling frustrated about our political situation. And that's a narrow place that we have to get out of. We can't stay there. And so the story of the Exodus is about getting out of those narrow places. And we enact that actually every single day during our services. So around, we went through this when we talked about the service, but around the Shema, the statement that God is one, we also have blessings around that statement. The first one is about creation. God created the world and thus gives us a sense of purpose. And then God revealed Torah to us so that we can live a good life. And then after we say the Shema, we sing the Mi Chamocha, which is a song that we sang after we fled from Egypt and crossed through the Sea of Reeds on dry land. On the other side, we said, who is like you, God? That's what Mi Chamocha means. So we say that as a memory of Egypt, but also as a recognition that at so many times in our lives, we feel that we've been liberated from a narrow place. Now, here's my favorite part. Judaism encourages everyone to ask questions about the past that can help us with the present. So questions are really, really important, as I've said before, in Judaism, and especially for the Seder, when we speak about, when we celebrate Passover and speak about the experience of being slaves in Egypt, it's centered around questions, as you'll see. Here are the different names of the festival. So Chag HaAviv, the festival of spring, because it always has to happen in the spring. Chag HaMatzot, festival of the unleavened bread. Matzah is the singular, matzot is the plural. And Chag HaPesach, festival of the Paschal Lamb. Now, as I mentioned last time, when we looked at Sukkot and Shavuot, and this is the third agricultural festival, the scholars believe that these festivals all were originally agricultural, and then they were overlaid with a historical significance. So they think maybe, and no one knows for sure, but the unleavened bread is based on some flat barley cakes, because the barley harvest is going on during this time. And there was also a festival related to our flocks. So there was also a lamb that was sacrificed. Now that was changed, of course, into the unleavened bread was baked because we were in haste and we didn't have time to allow the bread to rise. And the Paschal lamb is, supposedly we had to put some blood on the doorposts of our houses so that the angel of death wouldn't come when the 10th plague came along, that it wouldn't harm the Jews. So whether those were originally the reasons or whether they started off with these various festivals, no one knows. Depends on if you ask a scholar or if you ask a more sort of pious Jew. So a very quick Jewish story, and we're going to be doing the history very soon. But you have Abraham and Sarah. Abraham was born in Ur, which is Iraq today. And he eventually made his way to Canaan. He and his family stopped on the way at a place called Haran. And then Abraham was told to go forth, and he and his wife and his family, well, he didn't have any kids at the time, but he had lots of people around him. They all went to Canaan. Isaac is their son. He married Rebekah. and they had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, twins. Jacob had 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, with 12 sons and 1 daughter. And the 12 sons became the 12 tribes. Son number 11 was the favorite, and he was sold into slavery by his brothers, who were very jealous of him. And Joseph then became a very important person in Egypt. He became the Pharaoh's basically lieutenant or sort of prime minister, the vizier of Egypt. And he was very good at planning ahead. And so what he planned was the Pharaoh had these dreams about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. And Joseph says it's because they're going to be 7 years of famine, and they're going to be first 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. So we better store our grain and make sure we're prepared for what's coming. And eventually, because there was famine also in the land of Canaan, Joseph's family and a number of different Hebrews come to Egypt and ask for some food, and including his brothers, by the way, who don't recognize him. But we'll get to that in more detail at some other point. So once we get to Egypt, what happens? Joseph had been a very important guy. He really helped the Pharaoh in many ways. But as happens in life, one day that Pharaoh died, and eventually a new Pharaoh came along who did not know Joseph. Now, whether he happened to forget Joseph or he purposefully forgot him. Some of you may know the novels of Milan Kundera, and he, of course, lived under communism. And what did communists do when there was a picture of various heroes or, well-respected people who are no longer in favor? Anybody know what they do with those pictures? They airbrush out the people they don't want to have, acknowledged anymore. So it's possible that this Pharaoh Joseph was probably very famous, and people probably knew what he was up to, but all of a sudden he was no longer useful. This happened to a lot of Jews in our history, which I'm sorry, I asked you to unmute, Shay. I didn't mean to do that. So in our history, you had Jews who were merchants and money changers because they did not have other options in the societies they lived in. And so they often were very useful to the ruling powers. Who's going to collect taxes? Well, maybe the king doesn't want to collect them because it makes them look bad, so let's let the Jews do it, right? Or the Jews can help with trade or do whatever. And then one day they're not so useful anymore and they get kicked out of the country or they get persecuted or both. So this is that kind of history here. So the Hebrews become slaves, and eventually the firstborn sons are supposed to be killed. We'll talk about that in a moment. Moses is the savior. The 10 plagues God brings on to Egypt and allows eventually the Jews to get out of Egypt. And then the Jews wander in the desert for 40 years and eventually become a free people. Now you've gotten the whole history of several books of the Bible in 2 minutes, but we were going to do more than that at some other point. Okay, so here's a little excerpt from the book of Exodus. Would somebody like to read that?
I'll read it. Bobby.
Okay, please.
Joseph died, and all and all his brothers and all that generation. And the people of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And there arose up a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it may come to pass that when there would be any war, they should join our enemies and fight against us, and so get them out of the land. Therefore, They did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were mortified because of the people of Israel.
Okay, so what's going on here? What's happening in this story? Yes,
Pharaoh.
Christine, go ahead.
The Pharaoh is paranoid about an independent power base. And so
Absolutely.
getting rid of Joseph, like most pharaohs, new pharaohs got rid of the vizier because they didn't want any kind of power base independent of the pharaoh.
Right. Okay. Anybody want to add to that? Okay, so does this remind you of anything in our own society?
The last 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that there's this foreign people and, they're going to take over. I mean, he's worried that they're going to have a real power base, but, it's this idea that the foreigner is somebody to be feared. And so what is his solution, the Pharaoh's solution? What's his solution? Should we try to integrate them into society, Christine?
Wipe out their lineage, the firstborn sons.
Okay, that's eventually what happens, absolutely.
Yeah.
But before that,
You work them to death.
Work them to death, right? You work them to death. Now, have you ever heard of a situation where people are oppressed more and more and more, and that gets them to shut up and stop being a problem, or does it make it worse?
Makes it worse.
Yeah, so, this is so typical of a kind of tyrant who thinks that, okay, they're a danger. Let's just oppress them, make them work harder and harder, and they'll collapse or they will stop being annoying. Tammy.
Well, Rabbi, what I find is ironic is that this has been going on for so many years, and yet we keep doing it. And we as a society in the 2020s still haven't figured out from what happened in the 1940s and even back, and we're just not learning. And my God, the same script is replaying and replaying and replaying. And this whole idea that if we just stand by and do nothing, that somehow it's going to get better, when it's really incumbent upon us to speak out and say, this is malarkey, we're not going to tolerate it, whether it's Mexicans coming in from Mexico or Jews coming in or Ethiopians or whatever group, right? And that's, part of what we're being empowered to do by learning all of this and by gathering every Sunday, I feel, is learning how to find our voice and help the less voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you sort of notice that we never learn from history, right? No matter how many times we have to encounter the same problems.
Look at voter suppression.
Right?
Exactly.
Right. So, so these stories, they seem historical, and they are, but they're also definitely stories that, kind of are archetypes of what we live through all the time. Yeah, so, that first thing doesn't work. The next thing that Pharaoh does is says, he asks for the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to make sure that as they're giving birth to the babies that they kill them, but that doesn't work either because the midwives actually rebel against that. And we don't actually know for sure if these midwives are Hebrew or Egyptian. If they're Hebrew midwives, you can really understand why they would, defy the Pharaoh, though that takes a lot of courage. But if they're Egyptian, it means that they have a different moral code than the prevailing society. So I'm getting these text messages, chat messages while I'm talking. So someone said they're traveling and they can't be here. Okay. So we have these women who are willing to stand up to the Pharaoh. And what they do is they go lie to him. They say, oh, well, those Hebrew women are so strong that we were not able to do anything about it. So eventually, the idea is let's toss these babies, the baby boys, into the Nile, because I guess they figured the women aren't so dangerous, right? Only the baby boys should be killed. Think about that. Okay, share some more. Okay, so let's see what Passover in the Torah looks like. I mean, right now we just read about what's going on in Egypt. But what happens when we go to find out about Passover? So it says in Deuteronomy, you shall not have anything leavened with it. For 7 days thereafter, you shall eat unleavened bread with it, the bread of distress, for you departed from the land of Egypt hurriedly, so that you may remember the day of your departure from the land of Egypt as long as you live. Now, this is in Deuteronomy, which is a reminder, but actually in Exodus, we're told the same thing, that we should eat this unleavened bread before the Hebrews actually leave Egypt, which now there is an expression, there is no before or after in the Torah. So that can be an excuse for why it's in the wrong order. But if you think about it, why would they be given instructions by God to eat unleavened bread before they leave Egypt? Because they haven't left. So we don't know that they don't have time to let the bread rise. And this is one of the reasons that scholars think that this is, that there was already this kind of holiday to commemorate the barley harvest with these flat breads, because the instructions come before the actual event. But I'm sure there are lots of other ways that we can interpret this. As I said, one of them is there's no before or after in the Torah. So they get to, if there's a problem with the order of things, I'll say, well, it doesn't matter. It all happened at the same time. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. So we tell the story of what happened in Egypt through what's called a Haggadah. Haggadah means the storytelling. And there are many, many, many Haggadot. That's the plural for Haggadah. Many, as you see, Sammy Spider's first Haggadah, that's for kids. The one that we generally use is A Night of Questions, which is from the Reconstructionist movement. I don't know if any of you remember, maybe Beverly remembers this, the Maxwell House Haggadah. This was a little, almost like a leaflet, a very short one that we got through Maxwell House, and people use that. It's really dull because all of these other ones, it's not just, the traditional ones just tell the story and, we'll see what's included, but they don't bring it to the present. All these other ones, like a Global Justice Haggadah, will connect whatever's going on in the story of Passover to other things going on in the world right now. And even though I use A Night of Questions, which has wonderful commentary in it, which I include, but I also bring in a lot of other material from organizations that are, like HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which really focuses on refugees around the world, or TRUA, which is the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights. This year, actually, my educator administrator, Andrea, told me about a website called Haggadot.com. So that's the plural of Haggadah. Instead of AH at the end, it's OT. Haggadot.com, where you can make your own Haggadah, and they have all kinds of options in there. And you can just pull them out, pull out the ones you like and put it together. So that's what I did for this year. And that's why if you are going to be joining us, if you live in town and you can come by and pick up the Haggadah in a special gift bag, you should RSVP and let us know so we have enough. And then if you live further away, we're gonna make it available where you can download it. And by the way, picking it up is next Sunday from 10 to 1 at our temple. And as I mentioned, next Sunday, I have to move the time of the service, of the class, because I'm on the Commission on Social Action for the Reform Movement, and we have a meeting at 1, which I didn't know about. Okay. So here are, there's Seder. The Seder means order. So there's an order, not like the Bible where we say there's no before or after. There is this very specific order to the Seder. And so we start off with Kadesh. You may remember that we did a blessing over wine called Kiddush. It's a similar word from the same root, sanctification. And we basically recite a blessing over the wine. And this is not the holiday where you get really drunk, but you're supposed to have 4 glasses of wine, which I mean, if I had 4 glasses of wine, I would be drunk. So, but it's not like Purim where you're supposed to get so drunk that you can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. Uchatz, washing, you wash your hands because you're about to eat something. And really, I think that the karpas, which is usually something like parsley, I think the reason that we have that is because the Seder is often very, very long. And by the time you get to dinner, people are really hungry. So you get a little nibble beforehand. But you take the parsley and you dip it in salt water. And of course, the vegetable symbolizes the lowly origins of the Jewish people. And the salt water symbolizes the tears shed as a result of slavery. And of course, with parsley, if you dip it and then shake it, you get all the little drops, looks like tears. And you just munch on that and it doesn't really fill you up too well, but that's what you get as your appetizer. Okay, then yachatz, you break so you usually have 3 matzahs in the middle of the table. You break the middle one in half. And then you take the bigger one and you hide it. And it's called an afikomen, which is from the Greek, which means dessert. And then at a certain point later in the evening, after dinner, the kids run around trying to find it. And the one that finds it usually gets a prize. Of course, we usually give prizes to everybody. Otherwise, we get kids crying. Happens every time. So, and you know, all of these things, and we're not going to really go into all the deep possible symbolism of all of this, but all of these things can lead to discussions. For example, washing your hands with water. Maybe some people in the world don't have access to clean water, for example. That would be something you could talk about when you get to that part of the Seder. Breaking the bread or the matzah. Well, there's a lot of brokenness in the world. And when the afikomen is found, you can kind of put the 2 pieces back together, although they won't ever be glued back together the way they were originally. So, I mean, there are all kinds of things you can do with it. And that's, you know, why all these wonderful Haggadahs are out there to give you, you know, some food for thought. This is just the first part. There's more. Then you tell the story. But what's odd about the story is it's sort of broken up into little chunks. And it starts really with the youngest person asking the 4 questions, which I am going to share with you in a bit. And it's really, those 4 questions were devised by the rabbis as kind of a way to encourage people to participate with questions, right? So it's not about, you know, just the kid asking the questions. Everybody's supposed to ask questions. And the interesting thing is the questions are asked, but they're not all answered ever, except through the story. Because later on, there's a piece from the Talmud where, you know, Rabbi Gamliel says, the Seder must have these 3 things, but only 2 of them are things that were questioned by the kid. And one of them was never asked at all. So it's complicated. And you have to go through the whole story before you get to that explanation. And there are the different ways of thinking about that too. Like, okay, you ask a question, you don't always get an answer to your question right away, right? Sometimes you have to wait a long time. Sometimes you only get answers to some of your questions and you get new questions. And the story itself is a way for you to try to answer your questions, but it's not a direct, here's the answer, because there are no answers, right? So the Magid, the story, is designed to satisfy the needs of 4 different types of people. So there are several places in the Torah where there's the question of, what do you say about this experience? And so the rabbis are very smart, and they say it means there are 4, of course, they say 4 sons. each one with a different orientation. This is really very smart when you think about how people learn and the different levels of learning. So the wise one wants to know the technical details. We'll go into more detail in a minute about this. The wicked ones exclude themselves. The simple ones need to know the basics, and the ones who are unable to ask. At the end of the story, a blessing is recited over the second cup of wine, and it's drunk. So again, we had right after the first cup of wine at the very beginning, we poured a second cup, but we don't drink it until much later. Again, we have to learn to, maybe have some patience. Rachza is washing, and you wash your hands again, this time with a blessing as you're getting ready to eat the matzah. Motzi is the prayer that we say over eating like challah, for example, or bread. So you do say that one, and then you add a blessing about eating matzah specifically. And you eat a little bit of matzah, and then maror, bitter herb, which could be horseradish, romaine lettuce. I don't know how bitter that is, but that's a possibility. And you eat it. And of course, it symbolizes the bitterness of slavery and other kinds of bitterness. Then you eat this sandwich that Rabbi Hillel said the maror, the bitter herb, should be eaten with matzah and the paschal offering, which we don't eat. And so we do that, but we usually add a little bit of haroset. Now, there's no specific place here for haroset. The haroset is, depending on whether you're Ashkenazi or Sephardi. Ashkenazi, it's usually apples chopped up with raisins and like Manischewitz wine and maybe some honey. The Sephardi use dates, and it's kind of a drippier haroset, date juice, and I'm not sure exactly what else they put in there. But that is supposed to represent the mortar between the bricks that the Israelites used when they were building. There were these huge building projects that these pharaohs had, and the slaves were building, all of those projects for them. Then the festive meal, the Shulchan Orech. Among Ashkenazi Jews, gefilte fish and matzo ball soup are often eaten at the beginning of the meal. Now, by the way, I used to think gefilte fish was totally disgusting, okay? Because the only kind I ever had came in a bottle or, a glass, jar. And I think it's Manischewitz or something, and it just really was gross. But I've had fresh gefilte fish, and that's a whole other story, and it's actually very good for some people. Some people still don't think it's good, but my husband happens to like the gefilte fish that's in a jar. I don't know how, but everybody has their own taste. If you're not vegetarian or vegan, then you'll have some meat. Beef brisket, of course, is a Ashkenazic favorite. By the way, as you'll see, you have a shank bone on the Seder plate to represent the Paschal lamb offering. And if you're not into meat, you can put a beet on there instead. Safun, the afikomen, which is the one that the kids, are going to go try to find, and that gives them the anticipation of a fun thing at the end of the meal. So hopefully they will not be so impatient waiting. Well, our Seders are about an hour and a half. A traditional Seder can be 3 hours or longer, right? And you've sat through those, some of you. And, and a lot of times they don't really relate it to current day matters or really, encourage people to participate. And that really can be a drag. Then after the meal, you say a blessing, a grace after meals, which we should do at the end of every meal. Birkat Hamazon is the blessing after the meals. And you say it over a blessing over the third cup of wine. You drink that, then you pour a fourth cup, and then you pour a cup for Elijah. So Elijah was a prophet who never really died. He was taken up in a chariot up to heaven. So he's considered sort of a liminal figure. So he's not quite dead. He's not quite alive. And he's supposed to herald the coming of the Messiah. And theoretically on Passover, so you go and you open the door and you say, please come, Elijah, there's a cup of wine for you. And if it's not drunk, you know that he hasn't arrived. Then you do a bunch of songs combined together called Hallel. They're psalms. And you do the blessing over the last cup of wine. Now, we don't do absolutely all of this because, as I said, it could take 3 hours. And then Nirtzach, the closing, You say the Seder is completed and may we be in Jerusalem next year. And then there's some more songs. For example, Had Gad Yah, my father bought a goat with 2 zuzim, and then there's a whole series of things that happen after that. So here is a Seder table. So as you see, there's the shank bone, the parsley, the romaine lettuce. This is the harosith, this brownish thing. This is horseradish over here. And the egg, it's a roasted egg, and it's supposed to symbolize spring and renewal. And, you know, here's another one. And each person here seems to have, oh, this is, I think, gefilte fish. Yeah, that's gefilte fish. And then you got the wine and the whole bit. And then this in the middle is a matzah cover where you have the 3 pieces of matzah. So what goes on the Seder plate? Let's get some, oh, you know what? I better make sure I share my sound. So before we do that, let me just make sure. Okay, here we go. So one of the things that we say, and this is said in Aramaic, halach ma'anya, this is the bread of poverty, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Let all who are hungry come and eat. Let all who are in need come and celebrate Passover. Now we're here next year in the land of Israel. Now we are slaves. Next year we will be free. Now you're supposed to feel like you were slaves in Egypt and you go through the whole redemptive process. By the end of the Seder, you should feel like you've been liberated. But here we talk about this, this bread of the poor. And so we invite people to join us for the Seder. You know, that's always a really important thing, is to invite people, especially people who might be alone. You want to include them in the Seder. And you want to also think about those who don't have enough food to eat. There's always a reminder in what we do in Judaism. So, wait a minute. I thought I had, oh, okay. The 4 questions. So this is in Hebrew, and obviously most of you don't speak Hebrew. So the 4 questions, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halaylot, and I will give you the translation because that will make it easier. Why is this night different from all other nights? This is what the youngest child is supposed to ask. On all other nights, we eat leavened products and matzah, and on this night, only matzah. On all other nights, we eat all vegetables, and on this night, only bitter herbs. On all other nights, we don't dip our food even once, and on this night, we dip twice. On other nights, we eat sitting or reclining, and on this night, we only recline. So apparently, only wealthy people were able to recline while they were eating. I don't know why, but so we recline to say, hey, you know, we're not slaves anymore, and we're able to recline as well. And here comes this guy singing it for us.
Hey everybody, today we are talking about the 4 questions, but actually it's really the 4 answers to one big question. Now traditionally the youngest person at the Seder does the 4 questions, but sometimes that's impossible because the youngest person at the Seder is a baby. Sometimes though, like me, the youngest person at the Seder is 30. Who knows? Anyways, no matter how old you are, we're gonna run you through it so you can know exactly what this tradition is about. So the big question, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. Why is this night different from all other nights? I'm going to tell you why right now. Number one, on all other nights, we eat all kinds of bread. Garlic bread, regular bread, cheesy bread, challah bread. But tonight, we only eat matzah. Number two, on all other nights, sure, we eat vegetables. But tonight, we're eating bitter vegetables. Ugh. Number three, on all other nights, we might dip foods once. But tonight, we're dipping them twice. Finally, number four, on all other nights, you might sit up straight, you might recline. But on this night, you are reclining like the royals. So now you know, you got the whole thing figured out, but now it's time to hear this beautiful melody. You've probably heard it before, but we'll give it a roll. We'll see what happens. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. Mikol halelot. Here comes number one. Shebechol halelot. Anu ochlin hamets matzah. Hamets matzah. Halayla hazeh kulo matzah. Halayla hazeh kulo matzah. Number two, here we go. Shebechol halelot anu ochlin she'ayerakot halayla hazeh maror halayla hazeh maror. Number three, here we go. Shebechol halelot ein anu matbilin afilu pa'am echat. Afilu pa'am echat. Halayla hazeh shetei pe'amim. Halayla hazeh shetei pe'amim. All right, last one, here we go. Shebechol halelot anu ochlin ben yoshvin uvein misubin. Ben yoshvin uvein misubin. Halayla hazeh kulanu misubin. Halayla hazeh kulanu misubin. And that, my friends, is the 4 questions. And now you really know that it's the 4 answers, but I'll keep that between you and me. Happy Pesach, y'all! Ma nishtana halayla hazeh mikol halelot. Mikol halelot.
Does that bring back memories, Beverly and Christine?
For me, I used to say the 4 questions in 5 languages.
Oh my God.
That was my
Whoa.
favorite. I said them, French, Jewish, Hebrew, 4 languages, Hebrew and English.
Wow.
So it was
impressive.
Yeah. It was like my night. I would get drunk.
Yeah, you get drunk trying to get through it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Christine?
My little nephew, well, now he's in his 30s, but when he was little, he was asked, why is tonight different from all other nights? And then he said, I know. And my brother looked at him and said, why? He said, tonight the adults actually drink wine.
That's funny. That's funny. And it's sort of an expression now that Jews use, why is this night different from all other nights? In other contexts, it's,
yeah,
appropriate. Okay, before we go on, any questions or comments by anybody? Anything seem unclear or puzzling? Yes, Nathan.
I don't know if I'm gonna ask a really weird question, but since I'm a history major and I studied ancient Egypt, I was just wondering, like, I know most Bible scholars don't say the mass exodus happened, but they say something happened.
Okay, that's an excellent question.
And I don't mean to be. I don't mean.
No,
to
that's fine. Absolutely fine. As a matter of fact, many
I was
years
just wondering
ago,
how you reconcile it. That was just it.
it's fine. Absolutely fine. Good question. Okay, so I was still in seminary, so it was probably about 20 years ago. There's a synagogue in LA, Sinai Temple, which is conservative. Rabbi David Wolpe is the rabbi there. And he gave a sermon right around Passover and happened to invite an LA Times reporter. So no surprise that it got reported, saying the Exodus did not happen as it's described in the Bible. Oh my God. Again, one of those things, like when I say maybe we should think about selling our building. Okay, might as well put Jesus right in the middle of the sanctuary, couldn't be any worse. So there were people like Dennis Prager. There's no Exodus, there's no Judaism, So the fact of the matter is that most probably the way it's recounted in the Torah is incorrect, okay? If it happened at all. So let's just start with, let's assume it did happen, but the way it's described in there, very unlikely. A lot of details just really don't really work. Like, okay, 600,000 men left Egypt to go to Canaan. Well, if you strung them all out from Egypt to Canaan, I mean, they'd be there in, the same day. It's not even, it's way too many people to assume that that's really what happened. I mean, I did a whole study about this, and I'm happy to share some of that information with you, but it seems like it's written in terms of dating, for example. It's dated at about the 15th century BCE in the Torah, when in fact it probably happened in the 13th century, 200 years later. But it's placed in such a way that I don't remember exactly, but between, let's say creation and the Exodus, and then the building of the temple, that, it's sort of balanced out in terms of time. But there isn't a lot of evidence, if any, that there were Hebrew slaves. There's a group called the Habiru that might have been the Hebrews. We're not sure. There's just very little archaeological evidence, which doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that there isn't a lot of evidence. So maybe it happened. It's sort of odd to think about a people creating a story like this where there are slaves, as opposed, it's the opposite of what happens in like Greek and Roman myths, where somebody who is a pauper turns out to be a prince. But here we have a prince who turns out to be a slave, right? Moses, because he grew up in the palace. He was taken in by the princess. So it seems odd that you would create a story like that, which is not, really elevated in some ways, to start off as slaves. I mean, that's an argument for why it could be true. There is one scholar that I know of who says it never happened at all. It has nothing to do with Egypt. And what it is about the fact that, there was one country and it split into two, Judah and Israel. Judah was in the south and Israel was in the north. And the northern kingdom developed because the king of Judah at the time, Rehoboam, wanted to impose even more of a corvée, which is forced labor, and taxes on the people than his father, King Solomon, had already done. And so a group of people decided, never mind, we're splitting off and creating another country up north. And his theory is that this is a retrojection into another period in history, kind of like what Shakespeare does, right? Shakespeare will not comment on the current political situation, but he'll put it, he'll put this thing in Denmark or somewhere else, right? But he's really commenting on the current situation. It's an interesting theory. Whether it's true, I have no idea. Yes, Christine.
In terms of sort of Egyptian labor patterns, okay, it's not unusual for a pharaoh to use people who are either refugees or who are captives to replace the domestic labor force that they're afraid of rebelling. And so that part of it would make sense. I mean,
Right.
it's not slavery per se. It is corvée, it's
Yeah.
corvée labor. And they used everybody, that they could get their hands on, but they were very worried about their own people being taken away from the agricultural process and also rebelling.
Right. Well, there was a lot of interchange between the people who were in Canaan and the people in Egypt. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of verisimilitude.
Going back and forth.
Right. And, the bricks are the kind of bricks that were made at the time in Egypt. There's a painting of a group of people coming in. I think this is the Habiru one, wearing jackets that look like the jacket that Joseph got from his father. I mean, there are a number of things that lend some veracity to the story, but we just don't know for sure. We just don't know. So there is a question mark about, but it certainly didn't happen the way it's described in the Torah. I mean, come on, these stories were told orally for many, many, decades, and finally written down and then edited. So somebody was shaping all of this. It's not just raw, data from people. So all to say, we don't know. We don't know, but it's an interesting thing to question. And for a conservative rabbi like Rabbi David Wolpe to say it didn't happen the way it was described in the Bible, he didn't say it didn't happen. He just said it didn't happen that way, specifically. But of course, that raises all sorts of consternation among people who, feel that the Bible is infallible. So that was a very good question. Okay, I want to share a couple more things and then we'll take a break. So after the 4 questions are asked, there's no direct answer. There is the telling of the story. So we begin the story by talking about the fact that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And God brought us out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Had God not taken us out, our children and our children's children would still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And even if all of us were scholars, all of us wise, all of us elders, it would be our responsibility, mitzvah, which is a commandment, to tell of the Exodus from Egypt, for whoever expands upon the story of the Exodus is worthy of praise. So this is something we're obligated to do. And here's one of the reasons. This is just one of many, many, many places that you will find this kind of statement in the Torah. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. I don't like the word alien. I just got this from the New Revised Standard Version. The point is, we were aliens or we were strangers in the land of Egypt. Therefore, we know what it's like to be oppressed. We know how awful it is. And so we have a responsibility to take care of those who are the most vulnerable in our society. Just absolutely essential. As I said, this is just, earlier, there's a convention of my rabbinic organization. And there was a teaching about, the importance of justice and loving kindness and all of that. And this was one of the verses that was tossed in. And I thought, oh, I grabbed it. That's why I didn't change the word alien yet to stranger. But this is, really pretty much kind of who we're about. And our central story is the Exodus. That is our central story. Now I'm going to ask people for some ideas about why that's important. Why is it important that the Exodus is our central story? What does it tell us? Yes, Beverly.
It's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking about this whole idea of being slaves as so much a part of our psyche. And for me, it's sort of saying, it's like humility. It's like it's not always going to be easy. And the Exodus is that we're not tied to a land or any possession. Do you know what I mean? That we have a connection to something deeper that sort of elevates us beyond all that.
Nice. Other thoughts about why it's such an important story. What does the story tell us? Oh, Tammy.
I think it really sets a tone for so much of the tenets of this faith, which is how you treat other people, how you behave in the world. And as she put it so eloquently a moment ago, we're not tied to a place. We're more about an ethos. We're all about an idea. We're all about how we're going to comport ourselves in the world. And it does bring us to humility, but it also brings us to, hey, we got to take care of everybody here. Like, we've been there, done that, got the t-shirt. It was horrible. We've struggled. We've suffered. Now we gotta treat other people the way we wanted to be treated back when it was our turn.
Great. Other thoughts?
Not sure if I'm reading it wrong, but also about God's love for the Jewish people.
Okay, that's definitely there too, because God helped us out of there, right? Absolutely.
There's always that constant reminder of how you guys came from Egypt, so that's why.
Good. Any other thoughts? Yes, Bobby.
And hope. I think it's a tremendous feeling of hope.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Who's used this story? Other people other than Jews have used it. Like, who's used this story?
There's a movie called
Sorry?
There's a movie called Exodus.
That's our story.
You mean other than?
Other groups than Jews. Which other groups have used the story of the Exodus?
African Americans and
Absolutely.
relations to slavery and redemption from slavery.
Absolutely. So what this story tells us, I mean, what you've all said is great. This is just an addition. It tells us that things don't have to stay the same. That's part of the hope thing that you're talking about, Bobby. Oh, Stephen, go ahead.
I was thinking that there might be some historical accuracy in the Exodus.
There might be, absolutely, absolutely. So the story tells us that things don't have to be the same. That if you're in a narrow place in a Mitzrayim, you can get out. Now that's true for the Exodus story itself. It's true for all kinds of different circumstances, whether it's personal. You know, when you, as I said earlier, have a loss and you're so devastated and you think, I'm never going to feel okay again, but one day you do feel better. Or, you know, you're in a job that you are miserable in. Like when I was a TV producer, you can actually get out of there and, you know, have a different profession. Some people are still happy as TV producers. I'm glad that that's the case. I was miserable most of the time. And I finally took the leap into, you know, the great unknown and decided to go back to school. So it is possible to change your circumstances. And that's a radical statement, actually, because I think that the pagan cultures at the time basically said, life is cyclical, you know, just keeps coming back and coming back. And we said, no, there's history. It moves in a certain direction and you can move from this place to this place. And that's really a crucial lesson from the Exodus. Beverly, did you?
I was going to add one little thing is that you can move out of it, but there's also a lesson in it. Do you know what I mean? You have to bring with you the lesson that you learned being enslaved, you know, whatever that is for you, you know, empathy for other people or whatever,
Absolutely.
appreciation,
Absolutely.
better. But it's like you don't just leave it without having been changed by it in some way. And
very nice, very nice. And unfortunately, as we said earlier, people often forget, right? People who've been in difficult circumstances, a lot of times they move into some other circumstance and they forget what it was like before, right? So, and that's why we have to do the Seder every year. Hey, you got to remember this. We can't just forget about it and move on. You know, this is our story. We need to relive that journey every single year. Okay, it's 2:01. Let's come back at 2:11 for a 10-minute break. All right, I'm going to share again. So here are the 4 children. And we're going to talk about the sort of more straightforward from the typical Haggadah. So the wise child asked details about the specific meaning of the laws of Passover observance. What are the testimonies, the statutes and laws which Adonai our God has commanded you? To which we respond with one of the very specific laws of the Passover Seder. So this person, and it is traditionally the 4 sons, is so, smart and with it that he wants to know the laws around Passover. I mean, he's educated enough to know that there are laws around it. The wicked child asks, whatever does this mean to you? In other words, I am not part of this. This is your thing. The authors admonish this child as one who is not concerned about the laws personally, but only for others. This exchange reminds us of the importance of not separating ourselves from our community or from traditions that might seem uncomfortable or foreign to us, but rather to engage with them in ways that enable us to connect with our community. Now, the rabbis say that we should make his teeth grind together. It's like really mean because this person does not consider themselves part of the larger community. The simple child asks, what does this mean? To which a straightforward summary of the story is given directly from the Torah. It was with a mighty hand that God brought us out of Egypt, the house of bondage. So the simple child, is like, oh, I'm interested, but I don't know much. And so you're going to tell me more about it. And then there's the child who does not know how to ask. So I'm sure we've all been in that place of, oh my God, this is like so foreign to me. I don't even know where to start, right? So we open it up and explain it's because of what God did for me when I went free from Egypt. All right, so that's the sort of traditional way of looking at this, but there are a lot of other ways of looking at it. So here's one. The Torah refers to 4 kinds of children and 4 stages of spiritual evolution. What does the wise child say? What are the statutes, the testimonies, and the laws that God has commanded you to do? This is the one who is so wrapped up in the details of the laws, in being right and in being the favorite, that this person cannot be happy without being an authority. The person is asking for attention, which we can give lovingly. In other words, this guy is showing off. Now, another way that the mystics of the tradition have also looked at this as the so-called wise child is actually at the lowest level of spiritual development, because all he can do is sort of, learn the basics. There's no higher form of discourse or of learning, of like synthesizing the material, going beyond it. What does a wicked child say? What does this service mean to you? This person wants to know if there's still meaning in the ancient rituals and the retelling of the story. To this person, we must respond with any truth in our own understanding, with patience, and with the conviction that we are all still searching. So, we know plenty of Jews who fit into this category. Some of us are related to them, right? This is meaningless. The largest number of people out there in the younger generations are nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who don't feel connected to a religion. And that's certainly the case with many, many Jews, certainly in California. I think the rate of people who are actually connected to a synagogue is something like 20%. So there are lots of people out there who look at this stuff and go, this doesn't have any meaning. And again, if you're going to present it in a way that's just about how our ancestors used to do it, you're definitely not going to, get anywhere with these people. What you have to do is try to say, this does have relevance and this is how it can be of interest to you. And the mystics say, well, this is the level of being able to sort of sort through things and categorize things. So it's a higher level than the so-called wise child. What does a simple child say? What is this? This person sees all the inequalities of the world, its inconsistencies and injustices. One can say to this person that compassion is a precious thing and that it must never stop us from acting to make the world a better place. And the one who does not ask is perhaps the one most spiritually evolved, who does not even need to ask a question. This person accepts the wholeness of the world, in its entirety, enjoying the company of family and friends and the great blessings of being alive. And what the mystics would say about this is, the one who does not know what to ask, it's beyond words. The experience of the Exodus is so awesome that you don't have words, you don't have questions. You just are at an elevated spiritual level experiencing it. So you can flip this whole thing on its head and not see, the wise child as the best and the wicked child as the worst. It's, you can think of it differently. So these guys will ask all these questions and then you're going to go on with the story. And the story, we're not going to go into the whole thing because we don't have time, but the plagues, right? So what happens is that Moses and Aaron, his brother, go in to see the Pharaoh, and they say, you know, we got to go. And he says, no, I'm not going to let you go. And so what happens? But, you know, there's the first plague, the water turning to blood, and then frogs, lice, flies, etc. And it isn't until the killing of the firstborn that Pharaoh finally says, okay, get out of here. Although he changes his mind and goes after them. And that's why they're at the Sea of Reeds, about to either drown or be killed by the Egyptian soldiers. And God opens up the sea for them so they can get through to the other side. And then the sea closes on the Pharaoh's army. By the way, at the Seder, when we list these plagues, we're supposed to take our pinky and flick off a drop of wine for each plague. So the wine is supposed to be for a special happy occasion. You know, it's sort of a little bit of a luxury, at least in the days of the rabbis. And we want to lessen our joy as we think of these plagues that are hitting people. We have to still have compassion for these people, even if they're keeping us in slavery. We still want to be able to say, oh, well, this is hard on them. And by the way, they're killing the firstborn. What did they ever do to anybody? There's a whole counter narrative there that we could talk about. And also there's a midrash about once the Israelites get through the sea on dry land, and then the sea closes up on the Egyptian army and drowns them, the angels are up in heaven singing and dancing. Oh, isn't this fabulous? And God says to them, my children are drowning and you're singing and dancing. In other words, these are God's people too. And again, there is a counter narrative going on here where, you know, you can imagine the Israelites are leaving in the middle of the night and they're screaming all around Egypt while all these firstborn are being killed. Now, here's an interesting thing. In the beginning, for the first few plagues, as we'll see in the next one, so he hardens his heart. During the first 5 plagues, Pharaoh hardens his own heart, right? No, I'm not going to let you go. But during the last 5 plagues, the Torah says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. What does this mean about free will? Okay, we are going to go into some breakout groups to discuss this. We have 19 people, so I think I'll just do 4 groups because not everybody talks. I got to open this up to do this. All right, breakout rooms. I'm going to divide it into 4 randomly and talk to me about what it means that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And what does it say about free will? And how do we deal with this? I'll give you just a few minutes to think about that. Just join whatever room you've been assigned to. Okay, I think everybody's back. All right, what did you come up with? I know this is not an easy question. It's not supposed to be easy. There aren't always answers to questions, remember? That's the whole way the Seder is set up. You ask questions, you get a story, and then you get the answer to 2 out of your 4 questions. So let's hear some. Don't be worried that, you know, and think I'm just going to say the wrong thing or a stupid thing. No, you won't. You won't.
I struggled with it, with the predestined, you know, and then sometimes I look at, like, in life in general, sometimes we make choices and then God may direct us back, whether it be through punishment or other things, back to where you need to be.
Mm-hmm.
There's that thought process. Then also the thought process of, like, the 5, when he hardened his heart, the Pharaoh's heart, was that punishment for his people that endorsed this or allowed this to happen? I don't know. Just different thoughts.
Could be. Those are very interesting ideas. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Thank you for being brave enough to be the first one to speak.
Well, my thought, I was in the same group.
Linda.
Yeah, I was in the same group that Che was in, and I brought up the idea about, you know, if we don't have free will, then the kind of the flip side for me is predestination. Mm-hmm. And I've got a real hard time with a God that predestines what's going to happen to us.
I absolutely do too. Yes, definitely. Okay, Christine. Yeah.
Well, our group, first of all, it was a great discussion and in our group. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but I think we sort of came to a consensus that at some point, if you keep, turning away from chances to do the right thing, that at some point it's like you throw up your hands and say, okay, that's it. I've had it. There's no salvaging. There's no persuading this person. They're just going to do what they're going to do, and they're going to live with the consequences.
You're absolutely right. And that's pretty close. I'm going to share with, does somebody else somebody else have their hand up? Yeah, Beverly.
Oh, we
and then
had-
Nathan.
Well, Nathan can talk. I mean, we kind of looked at it differently. Pretty much all of us were very sort of taken aback by God wanting to intervene and harden someone's heart. And then we sort of came around to understanding that, but you still have free will, what your behavior is, what you do about it, And we talked about, the whole idea of heart, that if God can do that, then that's the beginning of a fanaticism, the idea that, you can use God to do terrible things. I think that.
Interesting. Good. Nathan.
I think Beverly kind of said what I was saying. That I mean, personally, when I was young, even being born and raised a Jehovah's Witness, thinking that the Bible was literal everything and true and infallible, I was still bugged by this verse because I thought of it as God not giving me free will, which was the basis of my belief in a way. But I kind of saw it like this. How you say the rabbis aren't in agreement with everybody.
Yeah.
When I was reading my Introduction to the Hebrew Scriptures book by Michael J. Coogan, it says that the Bible itself has different theologies within itself. So then that's how I reconciled it when I was younger. But in a way, I saw it. It reminded me of like whenever I get angry to the point where I realize that I'm wrong. You have that oh man moment. That's how I saw it with the hardening heart part. That's how I see it personally.
Okay, so
I'm not sure if I'm wrong with that, but
you're never wrong unless you say Jesus is our savior, in which case you're a Christian, not a Jew, and otherwise everything else you say is fine. No, you all came up with some wonderful ideas. Now, the rabbis of our tradition, and it's not all of them, say that the reason for this is that God is showing, Pharaoh was considered a god in Egypt. And so here, God shows that God is stronger than the Pharaoh. And this is a way to show all these marvels that, God can perform. That doesn't satisfy me at all, right? So let's see what Eric Fromm has to say, because he's got a very interesting perspective, which I think some of you alluded to. So modern psychologist Eric Fromm says that the Torah's description presents one of the most fundamental laws of human behavior. Every evil act tends to harden man's heart, that is, to deaden it. Every good act tends to soften it, to make it more alive. The more man's heart hardens, the less freedom he has to change. The more he is determined by previous action. But there comes a point of no return, when man's heart has become so hardened and so deadened that he has lost the possibility of freedom, when he is forced to go on until the unavoidable end, which is, in the last analysis, his own physical or spiritual destruction. So this is why I believe the rabbis tell us that if we see somebody who's begging on the street, we don't just ignore them, because that's how we harden our hearts, right? The first time we feel a little guilty, eventually we don't even see the person. So what Eric Fromm is doing here is changing God as some being that does stuff to us as a kind of, it's like a force, right? Within us, or, within people. And so when, the more we harden our hearts, the more we have a hard heart, and then we can't go back. I mean, we could, as somebody suggested, we still have a choice, right? I don't remember, Shay, I think, or somebody said this. You can still always go back, right? But it gets really, really hard. If you think about what's going on today with QAnon and all that, I mean, these people, get deeper and deeper into this, and to the point where they, you really have to bring somebody who's going to deprogram them. So that's how you lose your freedom and, free will, is by your behavior. And it just makes things worse and worse. This is one way of understanding it. It's also a disturbing verse, and, we can continue to struggle with it as one does with the Torah. All right. Something that we sing during towards the end of the Seder before we get to dinner is Dayenu, where we say, you know what? God's done so much for us. If God had only done a little tiny bit, it would have been enough. Dayenu means it would have been enough. And he's going to explain this.
Hey everybody, today I want to talk about everybody's favorite song at the Seder, Dayenu. You know, the one that goes, Dayenu, Dayenu. Stop! What does it even mean? Okay, I'll tell you. It means it would have been enough. This song is all about all of these amazing things that God did for us. But even if God just did one of those things, it would have been enough. If God had just taken us out of Egypt, that would have been enough. If God had just given us the Torah, that would have been enough. If God had just given us Shabbat, that would have been enough. But God gave us all these things, Dayenu. We're so thankful. Oh my goodness, it's wonderful. It sounds like this. We'll start with the chorus. We just say, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. Sing it with me, Dayenu, Dayenu. Yeah, you got it, Dayenu, Dayenu, Dayenu. Ilu Hotzianu, Hotzianu mi Mitzrayim, Hotzianu mi Mitzrayim, Dayenu. Sing it with me now, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. Ilu natananu, natananu etan Torah, natananu etan Torah, Dayenu. You got the hang of it, Dayenu. That sounds good, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. Let's sing it again, Dayenu. Okay, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. Ilu natananu, natananu et haShabbat, natananu et haShabbat, Dayenu. All right, come on, guys, sing it nice and loud. Dayenu, Dayenu, yeah, Dayenu, Dayenu, Dayenu. One more time, Dayenu, 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 Dayenu. Bum ba ba da ba dum. Oh, I didn't hear anyone. Bum ba ba da ba dum. Bum bum. Nice job. Happy Passover, everybody.
This guy has a lot of energy. Reminds me of those, remember those little jumping beans, you know, just very, very, very happy. Okay, so there's three more things I want to talk about related to Passover. One is miracles, one is hamets, which is the leavening, and one is women. Let's try to squeeze that into the next 20 minutes. So miracles, right? So there were all these plagues and there was the sea opening up and these were all these miracles that happened. So how do we deal with the question of a miracle? What is a miracle, right? Is it really going against, you know, physical laws of nature, or is it something else? So Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, who's a Hasidic mystical rabbi, maintained that whoever believes in miracles is a fool, and whoever does not believe in miracles is an atheist. How can the idea of the miraculous be meaningful to us today? We may be guided by the biblical Hebrew term for miracle, nes, which means sign. A miracle is an event that signifies something of significance, something that makes an important difference in my life or in the life of my community. A miracle is an intimation of an experience of transcending meaning. The sign miracle does not refer to something beyond or contrary to logic or nature. It refers to events and experiences that make us take notice of the extraordinary in the ordinary, the wonder in the everyday, the marvel in the routine. Signs do not violate reason or nature. They are natural moments in our lives that we recognize as transforming. So I wonder if any of you can give me any examples of what you've maybe called miracles, and that are not things that go against nature or the laws of physics, but that are extraordinary. They signify something extraordinary in the ordinary. Okay, Christine.
When my daughter was 4.5 when she came home to me and had been through just hell on earth. And there was one time when we were walking by a willow tree on the way to the public garden in Brookline, Massachusetts. And she looked up at the willows. My daughter's African-American, and I did her hair in braids. And she looked up at the willow tree and for the first time ever made a metaphor. She said, "That tree has braids, Mom."
Oh.
And that to me was miraculous. You know, that was just a transcendent moment of like courage beyond experience.
It's beautiful.
And deciding to be poetic.
Yeah.
Just fantastic.
Beautiful. Thank you. Bobby?
Okay, well, during the pandemic, I had time on my hands and I started going back in time over old things that I had produced, old films and stuff like that. And I discovered this piece about American women, and I sent it to a friend that had worked on it. And she said, "Did you know that Suzanne had become a rabbi?" This was
because I worked with you on the women thing.
Yeah, Suzanne had worked on this very piece of film. This had been, I believe, 35, 37 years have now passed.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a miracle and then I sent an email to the synagogue looking for Suzanne, and we connected, and I think that's a miracle.
It's pretty amazing. Yes, after all these years.
I'll go next because I was working. This was I feel miracles like daily. I just have to say, it's just a really kind of special thing that I'm able to do. I don't know why, but I was working with Maria Shriver, and I was very closeted, and she decided to do an hour special on it was called the Gay 90s, whatever. And I started to come out, and I decided to go on a cruise because I felt very isolated. And I signed up for a cruise that got canceled, and I changed, and I went on this cruise to Alaska. And who do I meet but Bobby on that cruise, and I never would have met her because I was supposed to be on another cruise. So that was just one of the miracles in my life.
So, yeah, I mean, it's like, when Moses is walking along and he sees the burning bush that isn't consumed, he has to turn aside and take some time to notice it. We have to notice the miracles in our lives. Often people will talk about the birth of a child as being miraculous, right? I mean, all of a sudden there's this new life, right? So it's just a question of how we look at things, right? Miracles don't have to. Now, if you go on YouTube, you can find probably this it's a short documentary about the plagues of Egypt, that it's very possible they were natural phenomena that happened. There was, I think, a volcano that erupted, and that caused, various things to happen. I'm not going to try to go through all of them, but one follows after the other. Like the Nile being red was because there was red algae in it, and that made the frogs jump out or whatever. So, and the sea splitting, maybe it was low tide. The miracle is not that it was low tide, is that somebody amongst the Hebrews said, "Oh, you know what? The sea is at low tide at a certain time of the day. We could cross through at that time." It's noticing that and realizing, but there's another very disturbing verse in the Torah, that God remembered God's covenant after 400 years of slavery. Like, what? Because the Israelites cried out. Well, if they hadn't cried out, God would have noticed. Well, the point is, God does not just come along and save you. You have to be willing to change and to move and to do, right? You know that if you've ever tried to deal with somebody who has an addiction, it's not until they're ready. You know, if they're not ready, you can stand on your head. It won't make a difference. As you said before about the hard heart. So we have to be willing to notice and participate in the miracles that are actually there, and they're not out of the ordinary. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Hanukkah story, because Hanukkah also has all this miraculous stuff, and we have to find out how miraculous was it and what is the miracle there. Okay, now, something that you have to do before Passover is you're supposed to clean out your house. Get rid of all the hamets. Hamets is leaven, so any like bread products. And then, of course, if you're Ashkenazi, anything that's a legume. If you're Sephardi, you can leave the legumes. Legumes like, beans that, get bigger when you cook them, or rice. But you're supposed to go through and clean it out. So if you have food that you can give away that's packaged, you do that. If it's already open, hopefully you don't just throw it out and waste food. You can give it to someone. You can, what I do is I get a box and I put it in my garage, which is separate from my house, which is on the verge of being okay. You can sell your hamets. In fact, the Chabad rabbi will help you sell it for $1. So that's what you're supposed to, and then you're supposed to really like take a feather and make sure there are no crumbs and, all of that. So you get rid of it, but there has to be a spiritual level to this as well. So I'm going to share with you from a colleague of mine who's very smart. And her name is Rabbi Toba Spitzer. Passover is ultimately about freedom and new beginnings. The Exodus from Egypt is a birth story, the birth of the Israelite people and of a new kind of society, covenanted in love and justice. Actually, some people look at the fact that Mitzrayim, meaning narrow places, is like the birth canal, because once the Israelites leave Egypt and go to Mount Sinai, they become a people. Passover is also a spring holiday, celebrating the first harvest and the new birth of flocks. So part of the practice of clearing out hamets is linked to this sense of beginning, of new possibilities, clearing out the old to make room for the new. In many Hasidic, which is the mystical interpretations, hamets is understood as internal obstacles and negativity. And we take this week of Passover to clear out as much of this as we can. So another possible focus is some kind of intentional clearing out of those internal tendencies, selfishness, greed, excessive pride, negativity towards self or others that are getting in the way of our own liberation. So if you think of leaven, what happens when you cook something with leaven in it? It expands. And so you can think of that as ego, right? My ego is too big. I need to get it back into its proper place. And as I clear out the hamets, I'm clearing out some of the negativities, some of the obstacles to my growth, some of the, enlargement of my ego. I need to get back down to size. And you can, as you're clearing through your house, you can think of ways in which you want this to work for you on a spiritual level. Okay? Comments, questions before we get to a very important section, which is the women. Okay? So I'm going to share this article. So it's the women at the beginning of Exodus that make it happen. Not that if you read a traditional Haggadah, you'd necessarily completely get that, but we're going to get it. Okay, so women are the first liberators in the Exodus story. So God sends liberators to the Hebrews. The women are the first liberators. First, the midwives who cleverly defy Pharaoh's order to kill all male Hebrew babies at birth. Then a Levite mother who realizes she can't hide her 3-month-old son any longer. So Moses' mother keeps him alive. The order is to toss them into the Nile. So she does what the Pharaoh says. She puts him in the Nile, but in a basket, right? She follows the letter of the law. Then soon Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses floating by, has compassion, and raises that leader of the people as her own. So she adopts him. So he, if you ever saw, what's that animated film about the Exodus?
Prince of Egypt.
Yeah, Prince of Egypt. Thank you. It's actually a very good film, and it's very well researched if you ever want to review the story of the Exodus. So Moses is, in the palace, growing up as the grandson of the Pharaoh. And finally, Miriam, Moses' older sister, who watches over him in the river. Miriam fiercely protected her little brother. Though she's a simple enslaved girl, she courageously approaches Pharaoh's daughter and offers to help with the child found floating in the river. I can get a Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you. And she does, her own mother, of course. So Miriam, I mean, that's pretty gutsy. You're a slave. You go up to the princess and say, hey, you know what? Because maybe the princess would have tossed Moses back into the river. Who knows? But Miriam says, hey, by the way, I have a solution for you. I know a wet nurse who could take care of this baby for you. Happens to be Moses's mother. And we don't know what, through her mother's milk, she is, imparting to her son about caring about the oppressed, because we know that the first time we ever meet Moses as an adult, he chooses the side of the oppressed slave, right? He kills the slave master. We don't hear anything of Miriam again until after the Exodus and the miraculous escape through the Red Sea. By then, she's called a prophetess, the first person in the Torah to be given that title. But what must have been like for her to be there through the plagues and the march through the Red Sea? What must it have been like to be an eyewitness to the mighty hand of God reaching in to rescue her people? The last we hear of Miriam is emblematic of the life of refugees today. As it turns out, some of us are never given an opportunity to leave the wilderness. Like Miriam, many refugees will die without ever finding a safe and secure home. They are turned away by our country, sometimes even at the airport, where they arrive with visas in hand after selling everything they owned in the refugee camp. We also know that many of them die in the sea on flimsy boats that they're piled onto by very unscrupulous, people who are like coyotes bringing people through the desert from Mexico. By the way, we hear a little bit about Miriam right after the Red Sea, because the song, the Michamocha, the Song of the Sea, is probably Miriam's song. And she is the one who has the cymbals and the tambourines and, leads the women in singing and dancing. And then we hear about her a little bit later, in the desert, because when she dies, there's no more water in the desert. So there's a midrash that there's a well of water that follows her everywhere you go. But for the most part, after the very, very, very beginning of the book of Exodus, you do not hear about the women anymore. And according to my wonderful friend and Bible teacher, Rabbi Dr. Tamara Eskenazi, this is what happens. When there's a revolution, which is what this is, often there are people, women and other kinds of people who normally are not in power, who actually have some power, and then they disappear and the men take over. No offense to any men in this room, but that's just what happens historically. But here we're focusing a little bit more on the whole experience of a refugee escaping persecution. Miriam and the other women must have prayed for freedom for themselves and their families. Like many refugees, they must have lain awake at night imagining life in a new land where they could settle and begin anew in freedom. A life where their children were safe and provided for, where they didn't live in fear or uncertainty anymore. And so it must have seemed like a dream when God heard their cries and began moving in their midst through Moses. Perhaps while Moses negotiated with Pharaoh, Miriam was preparing the people for the journey they would be making toward freedom. Perhaps as Moses was herding the Israelites out of town, Miriam was voicing encouragement and providing logistical support. Interestingly, she apparently danced and sang a sermon when they crossed the sea, and maybe all sermons would survive for thousands of years if they were as brief, expressive, and lyrical. Miriam's song punctuates a celebration after the dramatic Exodus. Her creative and embodied spirituality leads the women in thanksgiving and rejoicing. And like the women Miriam leads, I wonder if refugees, upon entering a new land, feel their troubles chasing them like menacing chariots. Refugees flee to a new country to find rest from all that has pursued them, looking for wide open spaces where they can breathe and express their thanksgiving as well as their pain, just as the Hebrews did in the wilderness. Very, very beautiful way of talking about Miriam. All right, I think this is very important. Who gets to tell the story of liberation? When some rabbis argued that converts to Judaism should not say, when I left Egypt, the 12th century sage Maimonides argued that the moment one converts, there is no distinction between you and us in any respect. So it is appropriate for converts to say, when I left Egypt. So when people convert to Judaism, they become fully Jewish, and you're not supposed to point them out and say, oh, that person converted. No. If they choose to share that they converted, fine. But you don't point it out to anybody, or you don't remind them, hey, you converted and you're not as Jewish as I am. They are fully Jewish. Therefore, they can say, when I left Egypt, because all of us as Jews, in a sense, left Egypt. It's our heritage. And if you convert, that is your heritage as well. And so I think this is really, really important. And finally, what does Pesach or Passover mean in our lives? Compassion for and responsibility to help the poor, the stranger, and the oppressed, as many of you pointed out. Freedom is to be prized, celebrated, and not taken for granted. We've learned that in the last few years, right? It can easily slip away from us. So let's remember the struggles of people who have fought for freedom for us and for others. Again, that's why we repeat this over and over and over again every year. We do a Seder every year. We all have our Mitzrayim, narrow places from which we need liberation. So we can take the story as a historical story. We can take it as a very personal story. Judaism values learning by asking questions. That is the whole premise of the Seder. We have the 4 questions and we have the 4 children. Those are meant as examples to encourage other people to ask questions, but it should be a very participatory experience. Each generation has responsibility to tell its family story to the next generation. So we tell our story as Jews that we escaped from Egypt, but also we have lots of stories about our own ancestors and how they came here, many of them through a lot of hardship. Some of us came on the Mayflower, but even those people were going through hardship, right? They were persecuted for their religion. So it's a very powerful, important holiday. It's probably the one that is the most popular for Jews. It's very home-based. We don't really do this in the synagogue, although I will say on March 26th, which is right before Passover. Passover is the 27th, the evening of the 27th, and then our Seder is the 28th. On the 26th, we will be doing a Shabbat dedicated to the idea of Passover. There are going to be some special songs that have been recorded by the cantor and by Elliot Levine, who's a soloist who's in our congregation. So I encourage you to attend that or to watch the recording. Okay, it's 3 o'clock. Any last comments or questions? No? Okay, you know that you can always email me with questions. You can call me. I will send you a PDF of the PowerPoint. And remember, next week we're meeting at 3 rather than at 1. No, at 3, right? Yeah. Did you do this, Doug? Yeah, 3. Okay, we're meeting at 3 to 5 just for next week. And there's a different link, which I will send again, just to make sure nobody gets confused. Okay? Have a great week, and we'll see you hopefully Friday, if not next Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi. Bye,
Rabbi.
everybody.
Thanks,
Bye,
Rabbi.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.